adoption of AI, where do you start? How do you do it securely?
So we actually, in the DaySIF, we end with a macro view of how we think this should be approached. So the first thing we say is identify your use case, right? Or the business identifies the use case and tells you about it. And the use case is going to consist of data. It's going to consist of stakeholders. It's going to consist of some compliance. And it's going to include some set of applications that you're going to use to serve this through or interact with this. And then the second piece is you have to figure out the deployment model. So just like in the cloud, the moment someone says IaaS, SaaS, or PaaS, you immediately know the risk implications of choosing one of those deployment models. Similarly, in the world of AI, there's a bunch of deployment models. If you hear pre-training or fine-tuning or prompt engineering or RAG, those are the more common ones. And then there's sort of classic predictive AI. You have to understand that because depending on the deployment model of your use case, that is going to have more implications on risk than any single other decision in the AI lifecycle. Once you have those two information, I know the use case and I know the deployment model, I can look at the 55 risks and I can narrow that down to the few I care about. And what I tell people is mitigate the ones that really matter. And it better be a lot less than 55.
Welcome, Omar, to Vigilance, my new podcast. Thank you so much for joining. It's so good to be back in touch. Of course, we worked together. Had the honor of serving you while you were the CISO at Highmark Health. And good to talk to you today about AI and the implications of it. It's like every conversation is about AI, and my big group of Fortune 500 CISOs really wants to figure out where do you start? How do you do it securely? So that's the conversation for today. Why don't you start by just introducing yourself?
Yeah, Pam, it's always good to talk to you. I'm impressed with how broad your network is and how good of a job you do of sort of getting into the mind of CISOs and understanding their challenges, and then, of course, connecting them to different ways that their challenges can be solved. And certainly, AI is a challenge that's top of mind for many. And since I joined Databricks about a year and a half ago, which is a company that's been focused on AI and extracting sort of inferences and predictions more than just insights from the world of data, that's been what Databricks has been about, doing that data performance and management at scale over the last 10, 12 years. And so since I joined, that's the world that I've started to get much more accustomed to and gotten the opportunity to learn from and understand. And I've probably been more a student on my journey at Databricks thus far than anything else, which is really what I was looking for, because I'd done the CISO thing for many, many years, done it for large organization and business units across financial services and healthcare and retail. And I thought it was time to take on a challenge that I wasn't an expert on and didn't have decades of experience under my belt. And I also sit on the boards of High Trust and the FAIR Institute. So I sort of the bookends of compliance and risk. So I think about the benefits of both, and when risk is a great tool versus when compliance is a phenomenal tool. And then one of my favorite things I get to do is I teach at the CISO program and the Chief AI Officer program at Carnegie Mellon University.
Thank you, Omar, for that fabulous introduction. And I agree. It's fun to constantly be learning, right? And this is a space where we're all learning together. And I appreciate you leading the charge. I loved what you said to me in our last conversation about this, that it's hard to learn the fundamentals of AI, but you can't secure something that you don't understand. So I'd love for you to expand on, what journey should my CISOs be on to learn those fundamentals so that they can secure AI?
I think, first of all, it's easy for us to put a lot of pressure on ourselves because CISOs set the bar really high. We expect to learn and consume at rates that sometimes feel superhuman. And in the case of AI, it's really, really difficult to do because, with most technologies, we've got a starting point that we've got a large amount of familiarity with. And the unfamiliar part is what we have to learn. So when we move to the cloud, we still had this construct of applications. We still had this construct of compute, except instead of compute being physical, it was virtual. We still had the construct of network and isolation and access control and firewalls and load balancing. Now, the way those got instantiated was more via software, and it was significantly more scalable than it was in the on-premise world. And of course, there were some nuances to cloud that we really had to understand, things like private link or other isolation mechanisms. And then containers became very, very common, and services became way more common in the cloud. But we figured it out because enough of it was familiar. Same with SaaS. We kind of understood the fundamentals of SaaS. It just was the application's running and it's being served and managed and monitored, but it's all happening in someone else's system. But enough of it was familiar that the newness didn't strike us as being sort of so steep that we had a tough time grappling with, well, how do we figure out what the risks are associated with this? How do we determine the controls to address, to bring to bear to mitigate those particular risks? The world of AI feels like it has a lot more differences, and in part because the world of AI has much more to do with the world of data and models, and those are two worlds that most CISOs, most security professionals did not grow up in, right? You find security professionals that maybe came from the softer side of security, that a GRC, audit, risk compliance background. We find CISOs that grew up in the world of security operations, or maybe on the application side, or maybe on the infrastructure side. So, we have CISOs that have expertise in those hard technical skills and those underlying technology constructs. However, I have not met a CISO yet that came from the world of data. That was maybe a database administrator 20 years ago. That I've never come across. I'm sure that will change in the subsequent years. So I almost think of AI as if it were a brand new language. And so if I don't understand how to say you're welcome in Chinese, no one should look at me and say, oh boy, Omar's really dumb. What an idiot. He doesn't even know how to say something so simple in Chinese. No, we would all look at that and be like, well, why would he? He lives in the US and he works for a global company, but all the business is done in the US and his students all speak English. So it would be odd to judge someone for not being able to speak a foreign language that they've got no reason to speak. However, if somehow I ended up moving to China for a new job, I would probably be expected to converse in Chinese. However, I'd get some slack and I'd give myself some grace to say, hey, I just moved here. I didn't know I was going to be moving here until the week before. It's going to take me some time. It may take me 6 months, a year, maybe a year and a half to get to the point where I can just get a message across, maybe 2 years before I'm proficient. And that's perfectly acceptable. I think thinking of AI in that way and thinking of learning the ABCs and the basics of the world of the data world and the world of ML, and you can't really understand the world of models and machine learning until you've gone through and understood the world of data. And the one, really, really simple example I use is I'll ask CISOs if they know the difference between a data warehouse and a data lake. And I think maybe 1 in 30 will say yes, but they'll still say, hey, but tell me anyway. What is the difference between those two, right? Those are things, data lakes, data warehouses have been around for many, many years. We've heard those terms, but do we truly understand them? We really don't. It's sort of like how if I was in the world of data and someone said antivirus and firewall, I would likely say, yeah, I know what those are. They just basically prevent bad things from happening. And yeah, maybe one runs on the endpoint and one on the network, but they're kind of the same thing. If you have a good firewall, you don't need an antivirus. And if you have a great antivirus, you really don't need a firewall, right? That would be the logical layman's view of two sort of really, really fundamental concepts in the world of security. So warehouses and data lakes are akin to antivirus and firewalls in the world of security. It's the thing every intern learns probably in the first month or two of the job, and they have it figured out. However, that's just the beginning. Just like in the world of cyber, there's more and more tech and more controls and more mechanisms and acronyms. We ran out of 3-letter acronyms, so now we're up to 4 and 5-letter acronyms that we're being blessed with by the analysts, and we're consuming it and learning it. Now imagine 20 years of innovation that happens totally separate from the world that we inhabit. And now we're coming in 20 years later and we're expected to understand it all. It's just not plausible.
Yeah. So where do they start though on those fundamentals? I mean, I agree with you. They should give themselves that space and that time to figure it out. And there is this sense of urgency. There's FOMO. They fear missing out, right? And there's pressure. There's pressure from the CEO down to figure this out. They want the CEO wants a competitive advantage. They want automation to save money, and there's all these things that are the promise of AI, right? And so there's all this pressure, and our organizations do look to the CISOs to say, we got to figure this out now because there's pressure. But like you said in a conversation we had earlier, what cloud came on the scene in 2005. We're still not fully adopted, at least not in my Fortune 500 group. But AI comes on the scene in 2 years, and everybody's like, "Why haven't you started already?" And so there's so much. My most common question in my group is, "Am I behind on this?" And I try to reassure them that everybody's pretty much in the same spot. And I love what one of my CISOs said: the only thing newer than AI is AI tools and to secure it. And so they're in a tough position, right? And there is a lot of pressure on them.
Yeah.
So I say that's a sort of a long tangent, but where do they start where do you think they can be in, X number of years, or sort of set expectations?
Yeah, I'd say let me first talk about what they shouldn't do, which can be very tempting. And I'll tell you, when ChatGPT came out, and it was before I joined Databricks, and I sort of just figuratively stuck my head in the sand. And I assumed it didn't exist, because as I started thinking about the implications of ChatGPT, it was too scary and too much. My cheese was going to be moved really, really far, and to lands that I had no idea what lingered there. And so it was just easier for me to assume it didn't exist, and I refused to even use it. Right. So that's sort of like the one extreme, which is tempting, so much so that I even fell for it. And I come across CISOs that fall for that routinely. I had a CISO that said to me, she was the provost of a pretty large university. And she said to me, Omar, the provost had sent out a memo conveying their Gen AI policy. And so I said, okay, so what did it say? And she put her head in her hands and responded with, "I'm too scared to read the email." Right? Okay. And that's sort of not acceptable, because the business is moving forward and security is being left behind. Now, in my role, I get to spend a lot of time with CIOs and with chief data officers. And it's heartbreaking to hear the answer to this one question I almost always ask them, which is, hey, how is your CISO involved in all of this AI stuff and managing AI risk? And in many cases, I know the CISO, and I'll offer to bring them in and to help them. And Pam, you might be surprised to hear this, but about half the time, the direction I get from chief data officers and CIOs is, please don't bring the CISO into this.
Really? What?
Yeah. So they're going to slow it down. They don't know what they're doing. They're just going to scare us more. So there's a little bit of plausible deniability. There's a little bit of perception where the CISO is the department of no, although I think CISOs have worked remarkably hard over the last 4 or 5 years to get closer and closer to the business. But what I see empirically is there's still a lot of opportunity for CISOs to get closer to the business. And so that's what we're trying to avoid. We don't want the CDO, we don't want the business teams to move forward. I'll give you one last example, and then we'll talk about what CISOs can do. I was speaking to a group of board members at their trade organization was holding a summit on technology governance. And for 2 days, the only thing they wanted to talk about was AI. Over the course of 2 days, with 100 board members, I probably had one-on-ones with at least 40 of them. At no point did they ever bring up the CISO. And
Here
they
we are.
know I'm a CISO. I was introduced as,
Right.
with my bio, and I teach in a CISO program. And I would ask them questions like, who is presenting to the board on how to do AI and do it responsibly and how to manage the risks of AI? And I would ask them who they think should be presenting from management. Not one person said, we think we would love to hear from the CISO.
Wow. That does,
Right?
that's a big,
That's now again,
I'm a little bit surprised, honestly,
yeah.
but that's because my world revolves around, the CISO. But yeah, I just didn't know.
And that's sort of like, honestly, I was super surprised because I lived in my cyber bubble for a long time, and that's what I knew, and that's where all my friends were, and that's where, I tackled all the different challenges and brainstormed with amazingly smart people. As I leave and spread my wings beyond the world of the CISO and spend time with others, I'm realizing, the fuller picture is coming into focus as that aperture gets wider. And I'm even thinking about some of the things that I thought that I had a good relationship with different executives and with different other stakeholders. And now I'm thinking, did I really? Because maybe that was the case, maybe it wasn't. So I'm rethinking a lot of that. So I'd say, the reason I start with that isn't because I love sharing bad news. The reason I say that is because I just want to drive to the importance of doing this. The importance of doing this is, of course, we want to make sure organizations securely and responsibly and in a risk conscious manner consume AI. The other part of it is just selfishly, I've got a sweet spot for all of my brothers and sisters that are in the cyber community. I want to see them not waning in influence. I want to see their influence grow. And I look at this significant appetite for consuming AI as an opportunity for CISOs to actually grow their influence, to actually build relationships, to go in with the CDO and with the business units and others to say, yeah, it's scary. There's a lot of challenges. We're going to come up with a playbook. We're going to come up with a operating model for how to do this. We're going to hold hands. We're going to go do this. We may have to experiment. We may make mistakes, but we're going to try really, really hard to make super small mistakes that are reversible. But we're gonna keep going. So this is an opportunity to essentially convey commitment to the business and to the downstream customers of the business.
Yeah. Are they not being invited to the table and they don't realize it? Or are they just not asking to be invited to the table? Or it's a I mean,
They, I mean, I was invited to go talk about AI risk and securing AI to a Fortune 15 company, and we had two EVPs and seven SVPs in the meeting, not anyone from cyber.
that's a big statement. I'm learning a lot right at this moment. So I know my CISOs will. That's interesting. There's conversations happening that they don't even know about.
Yeah, and so to me that is really worrisome. So I'll often talk to my colleagues and I'll say, "What's going on? Like, why is the CISO not invited? Can we please invite the CISO? Can I, reach out to the CISO and let them know this is what's going on?" Now, I have to also be careful because I don't know what's going on within an organization. Now sometimes there's really good explanations for it. Like in one case, I found out later on that organization ended up having an incident. So the CISO was super busy doing other things. So his other colleagues were helping out. That's awesome. In another case, it was the CISO. It turns out was on their way out, and they were going to bring a new CISO in. Like those are pretty legit reasons for the CISO not to be involved. But 70-80% of cases, it isn't any of those. But I'll work to say, can we bring the CISO in because we want to set up the CISO as part of the solution here. And to that point, then Pam, you'd ask, what is the solution? And as we thought about this, Pam, I thought this as we need to learn an entirely new discipline, and for me, I was sort of the guinea pig, because as I'm talking about, CISOs don't know this and they don't understand the difference between a warehouse and a data lake. To be clear, every single one of those anecdotes apply to me, right? I did not know the difference between those things. And I started to work at a data company where, in Data 101, everyone already knows this stuff. But we, as we were thinking about how to do this in a thoughtful manner, we drew from the field of medicine, because the field of medicine happens to have a richer and a longer history of pedagogy than probably any other field of study. And so I started looking at how do doctors learn to become doctors? What do they learn at medical school? It turns out the first thing that you learn in medical school is anatomy. So anatomy is just about what are the parts of the human body? What are the organs that make up the human body? So we said, if we're going to teach AI, let's start with what are the components that make up AI? Because if someone had asked me a year ago, Omar, draw me a picture of AI and here's a blank sheet of paper, I would have drawn something, and it would have definitely included pixie dust, right? Because I think it's just magic. I'm not quite sure how it works, but it's definitely magical. And so we said we have to start with a picture of what AI looks like. And so we spent months trying to figure out, what does that simple picture of AI look like? But it can't be so simple that it's not useful, but it can't be so sophisticated that it can't be understood. It has to be sophisticated enough that a PhD in data science or machine learning should look at this and say, yep, that captures it. And they shouldn't be able to think about any additional component of AI that doesn't fit into that. And so what we ended up with is 12 components that make up an end-to-end AI system. The next thing that folks learn in medical school is physiology, which is, yes, you have these parts, but how do these parts actually work together? Are some of these parts more closely related than others? So then you have this idea of not just organs, but of systems. So we've got the digestive system, and we've got the nervous system, and we've got other systems that work. Multiple parts of the human body work together to serve some kind of aligned purpose. And so we said, okay, well, there's 12 components that make up AI, but are there some subsystems that we could draw rings around and say, these are the subsystems of AI? And it turns out there are. So the three subsystems that make up AI are data operations, model operations, and DevSec operations. Now, when we start thinking about it, we're like, okay, thank you. That helps, because as a CISO or a security professional, I know DevSecOps. We've been talking about SDLC and BSIM and shifting left and that whole world for 10, 15, 20 years. We've been building good partnership with the application teams and the devs and all of that. So we get that. Maybe we've even moved to safe and agile, and we understand. So we get that piece. The model ops piece, not so much. The data piece, that's probably one of the more dangerous areas where we feel like we understand it, but we actually don't. And this is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where you have a little bit of information and your confidence is much higher than it should be. So we want them to move along what's called the Dunning-Kruger curve a little bit further, give them more knowledge so their confidence level actually goes down, because we actually don't understand the world of data as well as we should. And so we double click on the world of, what is the world of data operations? What is the world of model operations? What is the world of DevSecOps? That last one is the most familiar. And then you need some kind of governance across the entire platform and operational monitoring and maintenance. And so those things then are the subsystems who we think of as the physiology of how AI actually works. And then what happens is med school students then learn about things like epidemiology. So what we think of as the world of threats and immunity and vulnerability. So what are the different ways that the human body can be compromised, and by what foreign actors or internal mishaps can cause the human body to move out of stasis and for some reaction to occur that is going to cause us to feel unhealthy in the short or in the long term. And so that's when we think about threat modeling. That's when we think about risks. So we went and we looked at a lot of the amazing work that NIST has done and that MITRE has done and that in the EU folks have done and Microsoft and Meta. And we pulled all of those experts in. And at the end, we had about, we probably had about 200 or 300 different CISOs and cyber experts take a look at and provide feedback. But we had about a group of 15 core external AI security experts that gave us feedback into what we came up with. And we enumerated 55 risks of AI. So it's not an unknowable list of what can go wrong when it comes to AI. It's 55. Now, yes, maybe there's the long tail that of risks that we didn't cover. That's okay. But if you feel confident that you're covering the 80, 90% that are most likely, that's a really, really good place to start, to build momentum, to build confidence, to build process, and to get started. And we then said those 55 risks, we're going to actually align them to the 12 components of AI. Because one of the things that makes AI complicated isn't just the fact that it's 3 subsystems that are mashed together. It's that the number of internal and external parties that are involved is probably significantly larger than almost any typical IT or technology project we're dealing with. Well, I got the data. Where did you get it from? Well, 16 sources, and we got some from a data broker, and we got some from these sensors, and we got some from upstream from our CRM. Okay, my head's spinning, but keep going. Okay, well then, who's cleaning the data? What are you doing with that? Well, this person is cleaning this data. This organization is cleaning this data. Then we have this team does this transformation. It's this business unit that does this. And the data team here does this. And then the technology infrastructure team does this. Okay, I just asked for a simple answer. There's no simple answer. Okay, well then, how about like the catalog? Okay, we think we have a good answer for that. There's one catalog where all of the featureized data sets are stored. Okay, where is that? What is that called? Here it is. That's what this meta store is called. Okay, thank you for that. And then you keep going. Okay, well, who's training the model? Well, this model was trained by these people, and that model was trained by those people. What data did they use? What people? Who's been keeping track of the experiments and the lineage? And when the model gets used for an inference request, how do we know which version of the model and which data sets it was trained on? Okay, we've got to keep track of all of that. So the amount of places that you have to worry about is very large. So we thought it would be useful to say, let's look at the risks by AI component. So we can say, you're responsible for the catalog. Let us tell you what risks are associated with the catalog. You're responsible for the training data. Let us tell you what risks are associated with that. You're responsible for the data exploration or for the data ETL or the data transformation. Let us tell you what risks are associated with there. Now we can assign risks almost by role, and we can divide up this problem into manageable pieces whereby it can be operationalized. And the beauty of it is, me as the security professional, I don't need to understand every single component of AI. I don't need to understand every single risk. My job is to just figure out how to manage the risk. So if I know the components and I've got a list of risks, I can go to the person and say, here's the risks. Can we talk about these and which of these are going to be realized? Hey, don't worry about these two. These two could be realized. Okay, what are the controls? And that's sort of the last step. And that's when med school students learn pharmacology. And that's one of the last things they learn, which is, what are the interventions? What are the medications you can prescribe in order for that patient to return to health, or for them to maintain a level of health if they happen to be vulnerable or susceptible to some adverse condition. And so we call that, in the world of security, we call that controls. So what was important for us is to take those 55 risks and map every single one of those 55 risks to at least a representative list of controls that you could deploy to mitigate those risks.
It's just so fascinating. I'm listening to this thinking, you've given a very distinct and articulate framework. I love the analogy to medical students. That's great because we can all understand that. But 12 components, 55 risks. I mean, you've actually really defined this in a way that nobody else has. And back to the word fundamentals. I mean, it's fascinating because the framework you've described is kind of how CISOs think, right? And you're going to delegate. You can't own it all. So just understanding how to put a framework around this is very, very powerful. I love it. I mean, and so how do they, is this something that's written? How do they get access? Do they call Omar? Do you want to give out your cell phone? No, I'm just kidding. But, I mean, I know you're going globe teaching on this. I don't think my CISOs have a lot of exposure to it, but just the fact that you've broken this down is just remarkably powerful.
Yeah, so we've been doing workshops. I think we've done 15 workshops now, all over the world. It started off with just CISOs, and then I realized if we really want to do a service to CISOs, we should invite their peers. So we started inviting CDOs, we started inviting CIOs. We've even had board members in some of those sessions because we wanted the workshop to emulate the real world. And sort of like my aha moment of me as a CISO, I was in a bubble, but I didn't realize it. So I was like, with that knowledge, I want to now pierce that bubble and make life easier for the next set of CISO. So the idea is, if we just as CISOs talk in our echo chamber and say, here's how you solve AI, what we know is going to happen is every CISO is going to go back on Monday and they're going to say, yeah, that workshop was good, but in real life, that's not how my CDO behaves. My CIO isn't that responsive. My general counsel thought that was a crappy idea. So we want general counsels and we want them to be in the room. So we're starting to figure more and more of this out together and realize that there are stumbling blocks, and we realize that it isn't rosy. And so the idea of the framework is it's an accelerant, it's a momentum builder, it's to get you started. Depending on the nature of your organization, it may only get you 20% of the way that you need to get. In other organizations, it may get you 70, 80, 90% of the way there, right? Depending on how much you want to customize it to your needs. But the framework, you can join a workshop. We have one coming up August 27th in Pittsburgh, partnering with the Pittsburgh Tech Council. We're working on finalizing dates in probably October. We're going to do one in DC, one in Texas. We've got a couple probably coming up in Canada. And so we're regularly scheduling these workshops, and we keep them small, so not more than 15 or 20 at a time, because I don't like to talk a lot. Like, I want to ask questions and I want people to learn, and that's really how they're going to get value. In addition to the workshops, the framework with all 55 risks mapped to a total of about 53 controls, the 12 components, all of that in gory detail is available for free if you just search Databricks AI Security Framework, or DASF for short. If you Google that, it'll be in the top Google results.
That's awesome. So they can get access to the data without going to the workshop. But boy, powerful, yeah, right? To do the workshop.
It is.
So I'll make sure that I make that accessible to our audience.
And it is detailed. I tell people, please don't start with that, because it's an 84-page document that at some points reads more like an encyclopedia. We try to make it usable. So there must be 1,000 links in the document. So you can click on a component, then click on a risk, then click on the controls. And if you happen to be using Databricks as your data and AI platform, for every control, there's a link to AWS, GCP, and Azure. So you can actually see the knowledge article with gory detail on exactly how to deploy that control, implement that control in a Databricks environment. But except for that last part, 90% of the framework has nothing to do with Databricks specifically. It's intended to be data platform agnostic.
Good. Thank you for giving back to the community in this way. I mean, it's so powerful. And I get asked these questions all the time, but there's no definitive answer. yes, 84 pages is a long document, but at least there's some information in a definitive might be too strong of a word, but some answer there, some roadmap that allows them to think. And actually, some of my CISOs are also wear two hats, and they're also the CDO. And so, yeah, yeah. And actually, those are the ones that are leaning in the hardest, right? They don't want to wait, in between quarterly meetings with me. They're like, hey, can you let me know every day? If you called me every day, it wouldn't be too much, right? Because I just need to know. On that, what do you think of the technology? I mean, well, first, let me just say that you mentioned that adoption of AI leads to greater adoption of the cloud. And so I do see a play here for Databricks. Two questions. I think the first one is obvious. Why does it lead to more adoption of the cloud? Because of the data sets, right? You almost need the cloud. And then also, what do you think of the tools that are out there today? I mean, I feel pretty good about the tools that secure models, but not so much about the tools, if any, that secure, the use of Gen AI.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is there is a very prolific community of startups and founders and PhDs that are thinking about AI, that are thinking specifically about AI security, thinking about it across that life cycle of, how do we scan a model, sort of like I don't think we have quite a term for it yet, but the equivalent of, if you have an application, we know that we would like to run a vulnerability scan of it. Now, it may be a static code analysis, it may be a dynamic web assessment. There's a whole different range of ways that we can run sort of a vulnerability scan against an application. And so the equivalent of that would be to run a security scan against a model to identify any indications of inappropriate behavior. Well, then you have to figure out, well, what does inappropriate behavior look like? So if it's unfair, if it's discriminatory, if it's using foul language, if it's using rated R language, is that good? Is that bad? Well, the answer is a giant, it depends. And so similarly with monitoring the model, and when you see the prompts coming in and the responses going out, how do you know which things that you're worried about versus not worried about? Is this publicly available? Is it not publicly available? Are the prompts coming in from users that are behind a login screen, so you expect there to be confidential information? Are you tokenizing their specific data, bringing it in, giving the model access to it via something called RAG, retrieval augmented generation? So therefore, they should be able to get responses that include personal information, or should they not? Those are, I think, some of the big challenges. I feel like there are decent technology solutions out there. I see the bigger problem, Pam, right now as, how do I know what I'm solving for? Like, what is my problem? What is my challenge? What is my gap? And it could be different for every single use case that the business brings me. And unless I know that, I'm not sure what I'm doing. So, I was talking to some friends of mine that are VCs and have been funding a lot of these organizations. And I said, out of curiosity, I see a lot of these companies. I talk to them. We partner with them. Actually, in the DayCef, we actually call out some of these companies because we know people want to know, who should we work with. So towards the end of the DayCef, we include, hey, if you need someone to help you with model scanning or for this aspect or that aspect, here's the names of some companies, and in subsequent versions, we'll add more as well. But the challenge is, it's sort of like going to Home Depot and saying, I really need a tool. Well, okay, sir, what are you trying to build? Like, what is your project? Well, I'm doing a construction like, what are you doing? I don't know, but my wife has a long list of projects for me. Okay, we need to know specifically what your project is so we can tell you. Do you need a saw, a handsaw, an electric saw, a jigsaw, a chainsaw? My wife said I'm going to need to cut stuff. Like, that's all I know. And I always have to cut stuff. And there's a long list of projects. Sir, we can't really help you because we've got 3,000 options here and we're not sure which one you need. Right. So I think that's a little bit of the point that we're in right now, is until we know exactly what problem we're trying to solve for, what the nature is of the use case, what the business impact is of it going bad, what the risks are, what the threats are. We can't figure out the controls. Just like in the medical school case, I can't figure out what medicine to subscribe you until I figure out a whole bunch of other stuff first.
Right. No, it's such a great, you're so spot on. And I think that, one of the other things that we talked about earlier was adoption of tools is slow. Everybody's anxious to get educated, but it's like you don't have a requirements list. You don't have the basics down. So it's hard to do. It's great to learn, but it's hard to adopt because you're not 100% sure. Also, I call it ML SecOps, but, sort of whatever scanning of models. Is that might not even be in the CISO's wheelhouse. That might be more in the data scientist's wheelhouse. So, not to say that they wouldn't want to be involved, but they're not the only one at the table for that. So, but I think that I'm stating the obvious, the single biggest risk that is perceived is data loss. The millennials and the Gen Zs are using all of the, OpenAI and all the different Gen AI websites, and whether it adheres to corporate policy or not, let's just be honest. And so what risks are they taking? And I think that, we can have policy, we can even attempt to block, but it's like whack-a-mole. It's just not going to happen. So I do feel there's a rush or a little bit of pressure to figure this out because data loss is real. Right. And I do see some early companies in that space, but it's really early. I mean, I don't even think they're shipping yet, so, but any thoughts on, I guess you're right. You have to define what you're trying to control and what you're trying to secure before you can actually buy the security. And that's where, these 55 risks come in, right? I love that there's 55. I just love that there's a number against it, right?
Maybe I'll get philosophical for a second. So in philosophy, there's these two notions. One is known as universality, and the other is utilitarianism. So utilitarianism says, I just care about the consequence. What happens in the middle, what happens in the process, I could care less. The end justifies the mean. So if I can prevent that bad ending from happening, that's what I care about. Universalism says, no, I actually care about every single component, and I want to make sure every single component is done right. And depending on the organization and depending on the nature of the CISO, everyone picks one of those two options. So I talked to plenty of organizations that take the utilitarianism approach, which is, this AI stuff in the middle, ML, it's super confusing. But what I do know is data needs to come in, and I know data needs to go out. So if I just control those two things, I can ignore everything else. So if I effectively manage all the data that goes in and only make sure the data goes in that should go in, so I've got proper access governance. And then on the other side, I make sure data doesn't go out to any entity or user that they shouldn't otherwise have access to, then I'm sort of addressing it at those two ends. And I can ignore everything else that happens in the middle because it feels really scary. And I'm not sure how long it's going to take me to figure that out. But for this other stuff, I could sort of, shimmy my DLP tool and a few other things and basically get to what I need to do. But universalism says, I got to understand every component. I've got to do a deep dive into their architectures. And you want me to know the difference between a lake and a warehouse. And now I heard there's also this thing called a lake house. And you want me to understand mixture of experts, and you want me to understand RAG, and you want me to understand agentic AI and, 3,000 other concepts that I'm not quite familiar with. That sounds a little too much. I'm just going to go take that utilitarianism approach. Universality feels way too difficult.
Right. So, yeah. Maybe is one approach to define a use case. Like my use case is code development. I know I hear that a lot. We're going to start with code development.
Yes.
We're going to automate code.
It is.
What do you think about that path?
So we actually in the DaySIF, we end with a macro view of how we think this should be approached. So the first thing we say is identify your use case, right? Or the business identifies the use case and tells you about it. And the use case is going to consist of data. It's going to consist of stakeholders. it's going to consist of some compliance. Now, maybe it's capital C compliance in regulated industries. Otherwise, it'll be small c compliance. And it's going to include some set of applications that you're going to use to serve this through or interact with this. And then the second piece is you have to figure out the deployment model. So just like in the cloud, the moment someone says IaaS, SaaS, or PaaS, you immediately know the risk implications of choosing one of those deployment models. Similarly, in the world of AI, there's a bunch of deployment models. We think for now there's maybe just 6 or 7 that are the dominant ones. So if you hear pre-training or fine-tuning or prompt engineering or RAG, those are the more common ones. And then there's sort of classic predictive AI. You have to understand that because depending on the deployment model of your use case, that is going to have more implications on risk than any single other decision in the AI lifecycle. Once you do that, once you have those two information, I know the use case and I know the deployment model, I can look at the 55 risks and I can narrow that down to the few I care about. And what I tell people is, please, whatever you do, don't try to mitigate all 55 risks. That's a surefire recipe for how you get the business to run away from you.
Yeah,
right? This isn't an opportunity to get excited and say, wow, more risks for me to mitigate. No. Mitigate the ones that really matter. And it better be a lot less than 55. Once you've figured out what those are, then you can leverage the DASEF and it'll tell you for each of those risks, what are the controls? Go deploy those controls and monitor them on an ongoing basis. We think security posture management becomes extremely important in the world of AI just to keep up with the scale.
I love that. It's a methodology. And you've really broken it down into something that, some steps that can be followed. And I do think you start with a use case. And, I see in the travel and leisure industry, it's competitive advantage, certainly in pharma as well, right? Um, Automation's everywhere. But I think if I ask my CISOs, where do you think you'll start? The most common answer is code development. And I don't actually know why that is. I'm just, so we're running out of time. So I'll just, because you've walked in the shoes for many, many years as my CISOs, any final thoughts or recommendations? These are all really good because you've given them ways that they can take action, which is so, I've had AI podcasts before and I've talked about AI a lot, but nothing's definitive. And this is the closest we've gotten to really definitive. So I appreciate you a lot. But yeah, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say, the extreme of AI is scary, let's not do anything, or AI is just like regular deterministic applications that came before it, and we already know how to manage it. Please stay away from those extremes. It can be tempting. It can be very comfortable. I shared earlier, I fell for that. I ended up on one of the extremes. Pick that middle way that says, AI is risky. Let's acknowledge it. AI is not infinite. AI is not intangible. AI is not unknowable. AI is not unlearnable. AI is not unmanageable. It can be managed. It can be addressed. You can say to the business, yes, you can do AI, and yes, we can do it securely. So the idea is to have your cake and eat it too, because what's the point of having cake if you can't eat it?
Right. It's perfectly said. Well, this has been fantastic, Omar. I so appreciate your time. And I'm going to also, I'm going to get asked if I don't actually proactively give them access to the documents and yeah. And also the dates of your different conferences, right? Or workshops, I should say. Workshops is really what you're calling them. Keeping it small is really smart. I do the same thing with my roundtables, right? I feel like if I get past 15, it's not a discussion anymore. So that's very compelling that that's the way you manage it. Well,
Yeah,
thank you so much for joining Vigilance and joining my podcast. What a great discussion. And I know we're going to be in touch on this in the near future.
absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Pam. I enjoyed it.
Good. Thanks, Omar.